Hey everybody, I want to introduce you to our latest sponsor, Salt Electrolytes. Feeling depleted after a tough grappling session? Well, Salt targets your depleted electrolyte levels with a boost of hydration and health. It gives your body the baseline recovery it needs. Salt contains 6 different electrolytes with a touch of iodine to help maintain a healthy thyroid. No sugar, no dyes, no bullshit. Go earn your salt. Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of the BJJ Foxcast. I am your host, Alex Martinez, and today we have once again the great Trent Nessler on the show. Trent, Dr. Trent, thank you for coming on.
Please call me Trent.
Right on, right on. And my co-host today, way better than my usual co-host, Greg Mclarty. Welcome back to the show, guys.
Thank you.
So Greg, Trent, you were on almost 100 episodes ago.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I think you were episode
been quite a while.
Yeah, I think you were episode like 18 or 19, and this will be like episode 116.
Wow, congratulations.
Yeah. Thank you, man. Yeah.
That's awesome.
It's been a lot of just bullshit and drinking and, doing unhealthy things in the studio and trying not to let people know, even though we're putting it on blast.
Yeah, there you go. I wish I was in studio with you guys.
Yeah, man. So I'm sorry, refresh my memory. Where are you based out of?
I'm based out of Franklin, Tennessee, which is just outside of Nashville.
Right, but you have roots in Arizona, right?
I do. I grew up in Phoenix, grew up in Paradise Valley, went to Shadow Mountain High School in Paradise Valley, went to NAU, Northern Arizona University, and actually had a practice in Phoenix for almost 10 years.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, and your focus is, I believe it's the Athlete Lab. Right. That's your company, basically. Yep. Your focus there is to help athletes just stay in the game, right?
Yeah. So, I opened my practice, I've been in practice for 25 years, and I opened this practice really back in June of this year. It's been something that I've been wanting to do for quite some time. My focus is primarily around ACL return to sport, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and mixed martial arts.
Nice.
So I've actually got wrestling mats in my clinic. I've got a Muay Thai bag. And I'd say probably about 85% of my practice is BJJ and mixed martial arts.
Okay. So I was introduced to you through Greg, my buddy Greg Mclarty, who, I mean, best in the valley, keeping us healthy. But I'm trying to figure out like your guys' relationship. Are you guys like, teacher student? Are you guys peers? Do you guys work together? What is your relationship?
Yeah. I don't even remember how we got connected initially.
So Robbie had told you about me.
Yes.
And then you came by and saw my spot because you were thinking about doing something like the Athlete Lab. I think you contacted me. You're like, hey, I'm in town.
I did.
Do you care if I come by? I was like, of course not.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and then I actually think I told you about him within a week of that.
Yeah.
And then that's when you guys started talking. And now actually I am doing some of his courses and things like that to learn some of his stuff. Trent's been a PT for
20 plus years,
time.
right? Yeah, 20 plus.
25 years, yeah.
Yeah, so in my, the last time we talked, it was kind of like short notice, like get you on the show. I was really excited, and I didn't do a lot of research, I'll be honest with you. And I think I was full disclosure, I said, Trent, I'm in over my head. So I'm going to pull the cord, you run with it, right? But I've learned so much about you and what you've done. You're an author. You focus on a lot of things that I would not expect the typical PT to focus on.
Sure.
I think you have a book, is it like the firefighter book?
How to build a badass firefighter.
And you talk about like what that does for the public, what that does for the firefighter, what it does for the fire department, and just making people more efficient. And I never thought about these things. Like I just thought I want a big, strong dude that can get me out of a building. You know what I mean? That's all I care about.
Yeah, for sure.
But if you get a big, strong dude who's more efficient, uses less oxygen, they can stay in the building longer and do more good.
For sure. And injury rates go way down.
Yeah.
So, I would say probably my main focus over the 25 years has been sports biomechanics. And so I actually practiced for a couple of years, went back to do my doctorate with a focus in biomechanics and motor learning. And the reason that I did that was to try to find a way to help to mitigate risk for ACL injuries. And that's really kind of where my focus has been for the last 25 years. Back in 2017, we actually commercialized a wearable sensor technology that is used to assess sports biomechanics. in biomechanical risk factors for lower limb injuries. I say lower limb injuries. Originally, it was designed for ACL, but what we found is that if you improve the mechanics on this test, is that you actually reduce ankle injuries, knee injuries, hip injuries, and low back injuries. And we're actually starting to see some stuff now, because we have some professional baseball teams that are using it. We're actually seeing an impact on shoulder injuries.
Wow.
So it's been a lot of fun. I've learned a ton from it. We've got systems now in 5 different countries. We've got data on over 90,000 athletes, and that includes both sport athlete and tactical athletes. And it's really, quite honestly, it's just been a continually learning process for me, and just kind of, how do I use that data to really create better exercise programming, to improve the efficiency of movement? Because when you improve the efficiency of movement, you reduce risk and you improve athletic performance.
Yeah, and I've actually been through the test. Greg put me through it.
Oh, yeah.
And
That's awesome.
It can suck if you're not ready.
Yeah,
I wasn't. Right. I thought, I'll just jump around a little bit, something, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Had me jumping on one foot and move this way and that way. But what we found, Greg and I found that I have a low risk for an ACL injury, but we have to reassess because my mobility in my ankle wasn't good enough to get a good reading. So we're now, I'm seeing Greg twice a week now to get that mobility, because I really want to get deep into the weeds about this, because I'm 52, man, and I've been lucky so far. I've had a partial LCL and some meniscus, but never a catastrophic, ACL. And what is it about the ACL that makes everybody cringe, man? If I talk to a jiu-jitsu guy that went through an LCL, you're like, okay, you're out for a while, MCL, okay. But you hear the ACL, you're like, oh my gosh, man, that is like the death sentence, right?
Yeah, it's your return to play is 9 to 12 months, depending on, what kind of graft you have, depending on your rehab, your specific rehab, and depending on how you look at that 9 to 12 month period. So that's the big thing, is that it takes people off the mats for so incredibly long.
Yeah.
The other piece of that is that once you injure your ACL, there's 27% re-injure their ACL, number one, and 79% have osteoarthritis in 12 years. So the downstream effect of an ACL injury is pretty significant. So, part of the whole program has really been designed around identifying those risk factors and really trying to mitigate those risk factors. But the other piece of that is that we want to make safer return to play decisions. And Greg and I mean, we've been in this profession a long time, and how those decisions are typically made is based on a visual observation or some theoretical timeline. And, there's never been an objective measure for actually measuring human movement for making that return to sport decision. And so the AMI, fortunately for me, the AMI has really been a good tool to help to make some of those decisions. And we've got a lot of different facilities around the country that are actually using it for that reason.
It's funny you say that, because not too long ago, I was watching some video of I think he was a basketball player, maybe a football player, and they were trying to figure out if he's ready to play. And one of the tests that they ran is I think it was a 3-foot drop. He had to be able to do a 3-foot drop, and they're like, okay, you're good to go. Oh, okay, that's cool. You can handle a 3-foot drop, but is that really giving you all of the analysis that you need to clear him to play? I mean, if you look at when my son started playing Pop Warner football, the first thing they did was take a head injury analysis, right? They made a baseline.
Yep.
And actually, they did several. It was weird. They did several.
Yeah.
But he ended up getting concussed. So thank goodness we had that analysis, right?
For sure.
And otherwise, I'm not saying it would have gone misdiagnosed. He was pretty darn concussed. But
sure.
But they couldn't clear him to play until he got back to baseline. So it's a really good thing that you guys are doing. And I'm trying to figure out why more people aren't looking at this like a concussion protocol, where you get a baseline of where somebody is and you can work on those deficiencies in their movement.
Yeah, it's been interesting to me. Again, we launched this back in 2017, and it's, part of it is just making awareness. Part of it is getting it involved in research so that more people are exposed to it. most of the teams and organizations that we work with do use that as a baseline test. So they do it as a part of their preseason physicals, so that they have something to go back to measure it against. You know,
do
do
you notice how Trent just flexed for us on the camera? Showed that bicep with the veins and stuff. And he got his arm out like that. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. I had to
so it's that part, right? No, but it's having that ability to go back and measure against that. You know, and part of that is good, and part of that is, you know, some of it is predictive, some of it is not predictive, because you may have those movement patterns there present, which puts you at risk for that ACL, versus the concussion test, which is measuring your neurocognitive level prior to a concussion and measuring your neurocognitive level after a concussion. Whereas a lot of times, the majority of ACL injuries are non-contact in orientation, simply meaning that you change in direction. And when you change in that direction, that's where you fall into this, what we call a dynamic valgus, which results in the ACL being torn. You know, so you may actually have that movement pattern, but how our teams are using it, how organizations are using it, is they're identifying those movement patterns and then using that information to create better exercise programming to help to mitigate the risk for that.
Nice. So just from a macro level, how many ACL injuries do you see? I mean, are there per year? Let's just say in like athletes,
250,000 across the U.S.
Wow.
Every single year.
Wow.
It is a $5 billion healthcare cost.
Wow.
$5 billion.
And what do you think? And I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, for a young athlete, those that are you know, junior high school, if they tear their ACL, they are 3 times more likely to re-tear their ACL if they go on into college sports.
Wow.
I think in your course you actually talk about something like the UFC. It was ACL surgeries only that you were talking about. He broke down like the cost of having to rehab or surgical,
and that was only like five or six. Yeah, athletes.
It was like a really low, and it was like millions, right?
Yeah, it was $10 million.
Yeah,
it was a $10 million cost in lost revenue.
Is that annually? You know, annually for ACLs?
So that was what I did is I took five separate cases of fighters. One of them was George St. Pierre, who had torn their ACL, and the cost for the surgery, the cost of the rehab, plus the cost of lost ticket sales. You know, because he had to pull out of a fight. So you know, you start talking about that. You know, that cost, and especially in an organization like that, it adds up very, very, very quick.
Yeah.
But you start thinking about that in professional sports. That's why in professional sports, especially in like the NFL, it is such a big issue, because, you know, you not only are you paying for an athlete to be paid while they're not performing on the field. I hate to say it that way, but they're not performing on the field.
Yeah.
You're also paying for that person to come in and replace them. And there's a cost to the loss or losses that you may have as a result of that player being out.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So the financial cost in professional sports is pretty significant. And, you know, in the general public, so that 250,000 number that I gave you comes out of the general public. That's, you know, junior high, high school, college, etc.
Yeah.
Weekend warriors, etc. And that $5 billion cost is not only the initial injury, but also the downstream injuries, because, you know, 79% have osteoarthritis in 12 years. 79% have osteoarthritis in 12 years. You know, because you're replacing a structure, and no matter how good your surgeon is, it's not as good as the original structure.
Yeah.
And so there's some things in that. But I'll tell you, you know, so we just we're participating in this research study right now that is really, quite honestly, I'm super excited to see actually what comes out of it, because it is a game changer when it comes to ACLs. So we've got a group who is taking an ACL graft And when they insert it, they do what is called an internal brace around the outside of the graft. And this internal brace acts as an external structure to take up the stress on the ACL. And then between the internal brace and the ACL, they stick stem cells. So they inject it full of stem cells. And what they're finding is that they're returning athletes to sport in 4.5 months.
Whoa.
Which is insane. The particular study that we're a part of includes a guy by the name of Timothy Hewitt, who's in the ACL literature is like the biggest published researcher in ACL. The study is going across 5 different countries. And part of what we're trying to see is how do their biomechanics compare at 4.5 months compared to normatives, and then also compared to other folks who've had a traditional ACL or a traditional ACL route.
Yeah. So let's there's 2 things in my head. Well, 3.
Yeah.
So the first one is after listening to a lot of your talks and a lot of the stuff that you've done in the past, I'd like to think that okay, I was in this la la land where I was like, okay, I kind of understand, the mobility piece and, the speed at which the knee goes in whatever direction. I'm like, okay, I can follow that. But then you start talking about different things like, if you're concussed, if you're dehydrated, there's a multi-variable,
multi-tier.
You got to look at all of those tiers. How do you gather all of that data to help people, in their search for this, I hate to say it, but cure for the ACL.
Yeah. So that's, so the interesting thing is that when we were first putting together the AMI, one of the things that was super important to me is that we be able to store and collect all of that data. And the company that I partnered with on this particular project is a company called Dorsavi. They're out of Australia. They aren't a research-based company. But, and when we first started talking about this, they're like, well, why do you want all of that data? And I'm like, because really, quite honestly, the data is the value. So every assessment that is performed, we capture 3,500 data points.
Wow.
And that includes your demographic information. So we know if you're male or female, we know what sport you play, we know what position you play, we know if you've had a previous ACL injury, a concussion, a knee injury, etc. So we're now able to start making some correlations to the data. So now, because we have so many systems out there and we've collected data for so long, we have data on 90,000 athletes, which equates to over 320 million data points related to human movement.
Wow.
That being said, the data is teaching us so much. So for example, one of the things that I'm completely fascinated by right now is the correlation of the pelvis to loading of the lower limb. So if this is your pelvis and this is your stance leg and you jump up in the air and you land and your pelvis drops like this, your center of mass, it's all related to what the pelvis does to your center of mass. So if you land and your pelvis falls like this, your center of mass goes that way, you start to lose your balance. So one of the things that we now measure with our new system is what is called time to stability. So what we know from the research is that if you jump up in the air and you land and you go hop, 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 hop to get stable, the time that it takes you to get stable, the longer that time is, the greater risk you're at. Wow. So now what we're doing is we're starting to find correlations with time to stability and risk. But the other thing is that if you land and your pelvis goes this way and your center of mass goes that way, when you land, what it actually does is it drives your knee into a greater degree of dynamic valgus and your speed of dynamic valgus is greater. So the coolest part of all of that is what it's allowed us to do from a treatment and exercise perspective. Because one of the things that came out of that was, for me, a better understanding of the role of the pelvis, but more importantly, how do I create training programs to improve stability of the pelvis? Mm-hmm. So one of the programs that we launched last year is called the Vector Warrior Resiliency Program. It's a program that was designed specifically for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu athletes, for those who train combative training and military personnel, and those who train defensive tactics training in law enforcement, because the mechanisms of injury are very similar. And one of the techniques that we did is we use this, what is called a torso strap. So it's a strap that you put your arm through. It straps around your shoulder, straps around your hip. And what we do is, when I was traditionally, I would think of rotational training a little bit differently. What this does is it actually causes your shoulder to rotate one way. It causes your pelvis to rotate another way. And then we have you do single leg activity. So you have to stabilize your trunk from rotating one direction. You have to stabilize your pelvis from rotating another direction while doing like a single leg squat. That has been awesome, because what I'm seeing is that when people improve their performance on that, is that I'm seeing it directly reflected in the scoring or the stability of the pelvis during single limb activities.
Wow.
So to me, that's where the data comes into play, because it's not about the data itself. It's the data, it's the correlations that we then begin to make, and then it's reverse engineering. Okay, so we see this movement, we see it correlated with these particular injuries. Now, what kind of exercise programming can we do to improve those specific movement patterns to have a better carryover to actual activity? Because, historically we would say, well, as a physical therapist, I'm a movement specialist, and the exercise I'm going to do is going to improve your movement. Well, that's not necessarily the case, and we've seen that. My goal was always to use the data that we get from the AMI to really drive better, more effective, more efficient programming to improve that movement, to reduce risk, but also drive performance.
Wow. So I've been through some of the testing with Greg. And Greg, do you want to share how awful my testing was?
Dude, I can't even.
I wasn't even ready.
Yeah.
And he's like, so let's just talk about the placement of the probes and what they're, because he put some on my spine basically, right? And then he put some on my, I think it was like upper leg and then lower.
Yep. No, just the shin.
Just the shin.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and then I went through a series of planks, and then I was hopping, squatting, hopping, stuff like that. Can you kind of talk about what the position of those, the probes and why that's important?
So we have 4 sensors. Each sensor has an IMU in it. It's an inertial measurement unit, has an accelerometer, gyrometer, magnetometer. So it detects motion, rotation, acceleration data all at the same time. And what we do is we put one on your thoracic spine, one on your lumbar spine, and then we have one on each tibia. And what that allows us to do is start to make connections and correlations between pelvic motion to tibial motion. So we go through a series of tests that includes the plank. You do a squat, you do a side plank right, side plank left, and then you do everything on the right side, and then you repeat all the tests on the left side. So the right side, we do a single leg squat, you do a single leg hop. We do what is called a hop plant. So you jump forwards, backwards, out, and in, and then ankle lunge test. And then we repeat that on the left side. So from that data, we then capture all of this 3,500 data points, and we look at a lot of different things. We're looking, for planks, for example. One of the things that we're looking for in a regular plank is we're looking for your ability to stabilize your pelvis in flexion extension, but also in rotation. Then in the squat, what we're looking for, one of the main things we're looking for is when you squat, if I put a plumb line right down the center of you and you squat, your hips should remain relatively equal distance from that plumb line. A lot of people tend to shift their weight off to one side, which is not bad if you only do that for 1 rep. But if you do that consistently, what you're doing is you're creating an imbalance in muscle activity between your right side and your left side. So that can add to weaknesses, in variances in strength between the right side and the left side. It also changes loading patterns on one side versus the other side. So you get more stress on your right hip or your left hip or whatever side you're shifting to. The other thing that we look at with a squat is how much forward flexion do you have? If you have too much forward flexion, obviously it's going to hurt your low back. It's going to put a lot of stress on your disc. During the side planks, we look at your ability to stabilize in side bending and in rotation. And then all of the single leg activities, we measure the same thing on all the single leg activities. We're looking to see what is your depth of your motion during the activity. Because when you jump up in the air and you land, number one, if you don't bend enough, you add to what is called a hard landing, which is not good for the joint. And we want to see how much, and a lot of times people will modify their range of motion if they know or they feel or they subconsciously are aware that they don't have that stability. So we measure the depths of the motion. We measure how much does your knee go in towards midline. So we call it dynamic valgus. We measure the speed at which it goes in towards midline, because one of the things that we found is that the amount of motion that your knee goes in towards midline is important, but it's actually more important of how fast it goes in towards midline. Yeah. The faster it goes in towards midline, the more force there is, which means it's more stress to your ACL, your meniscus, et cetera. Then the next thing that we look at is your pelvis. How stable is your pelvis? How much does your pelvis move this way? How much does your pelvis move that way? So we measure all of these things on the single leg squat, the single leg hop, and the hop plant. And then what we do is we bring all of that data together, because one of the things that we know is if there's a big variance between your right side and your left side, we call it limb symmetry index. If there's a big variance between those two sides, you're at much greater risk for an injury. Wow. But here's the other thing that we found is that, you know what, you can be symmetrically bad. Is, you know, if you jump up in the air and both knees go in towards midline and hit each other, well, you're symmetrical, but you're symmetrically bad.
Yeah.
So one of the other things that we look at is we look at the quality, we call it the limb quality index. We look at the quality of your motion during the performance of each task. So it's a measure of your ability to do the task, but also what is the quality of your movement during the performance of that task. Now, for our our soccer players, our basketball players, running athletes, the AMI also includes an A-cell D-cell test. So it's a 30-yard maximal acceleration and deacceleration. So in 30 yards, you run as fast as you can and slow down as fast as you can within that 30-yard frame. And what that allows us to do is grab, symmetry in your loading on your right side and your left side. It allows us to see ground reaction forces on your right side and your left side, and how you control your limb coming into contact with the ground, which is super important to prevent stress fractures and things like that.
Yeah, I imagine like soccer players, lacrosse players, basketball players, all that's critical because you're constantly speeding up, slowing down.
For sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And how you do that is what we saw early on with the earlier version of the EMI is that there was a strong correlation with movement to these abnormal loading patterns with acceleration and deacceleration. Now, the other thing I'll tell you is that, for our high-level mixed martial artists, I've had a few professional fighters that I've done assessments on. And typically, if I put them through the EMI, I don't see a whole lot of deviation. And so one of the other things that we added to it is what is called the FAST FP. So Functional Agility Short-Term Fatigue Protocol, which is basically a 4.5 minute fatigue protocol that will bring the athlete to a very high level of fatigue. And then we put them through the movement assessment, and it really draws out a lot of those deviations.
Yeah.
That piece alone has really taught me a lot, because one of the things that I found, or a concept that I use when I train people, is called fatigue state training. So what I do is I use blood flow restriction training, which we talked about last time.
Yep.
I use BFR as a way of inducing high levels of fatigue into an athlete. And then I remove the BFR, and then I train them in that fatigue state for movement specific stuff. So I will make them really tired, gassed, and then make them move in these movement patterns that I know that they're falling apart in, so that they start to control that. Because what we see is, when you get a black belt on the mats and they're going into, 5 minutes, 6 minutes, 7 minutes, 8 minutes, they start moving completely differently. Especially if you're going in for shots or something like that, or if you get into later rounds of a fight, their movement patterns they're getting gassed. And so they're not moving as efficiently. So you start to see some of these movement patterns come out. And by training in that state, what you do is the default movement pattern that the brain would go to then is these movement patterns that they've trained in that fatigue state.
Gotcha. And sorry, Greg, you were going to say something.
I wanted to add something because you kind of asked me about specifically about your stuff, and I wanted to like go back to like what you said about how your ankle wasn't moving very well. So some of the stuff that he talked about with the fact that like you might not, because you kind of subconsciously know that you're unstable, you might not move as much. I think that plays a big role into what you're talking about, because as you're landing, you're kind of not bending your knee. So your ankle's not so the movement that you're talking about is tibial inclination. So it doesn't travel forward over the ankle as much. And that's because you're not trusting your leg enough to land on it.
Oh,
right?
I see.
So
okay.
Well, I wouldn't really say that it puts you at a low risk. I probably would say you're probably at a higher risk of ACL injury because of that, not a
Gotcha.
lower risk.
Yeah.
But I think your numbers just didn't really show as much in the AMI score itself, the actual, because if you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what we're looking at for injury risk, right? So
so the EMI score, one of the things that I've tried to make really clear is that it's not a number that's associated with risk.
Okay.
Because there are folks, for example, if you present with hard landings, there's limitations of the technology. The technology is simply not going to be able to account for that. So if you lack tibial inclination, which we were just talking about, or ankle motion, then you may actually score a little bit better. Now you're being penalized in the score for not going to the depth, but we don't specifically know how much of a penalty should that be.
Okay.
So what we're trying to do over time, like if you look at the EMI when it was first released back in 2017 to the EMI today, it is drastically different. The first version only measured 1,500 data points. Today we're measuring 3,500 data points. And what I will tell you is that's gone up from 3,500 data points because now we have time to stability. So, we're probably sitting around 4,000 data points for every assessment. With each new data point that we put in, we then have to collect a lot of more subjects to see what those correlations are.
Yeah.
But the goal is to constantly be updating the knowledge that we have so that, clinicians like Greg and I can constantly get better at what we do to make you a better athlete and mitigate your risk for injury.
Well, first of all, I always thank Greg for even considering me an athlete. So that's kind of nice. I do appreciate that. But I've been working with Greg and his partner, Wadis. They're in the same building. So Control Physical Therapy and Unfair Advantage, they're in the same facility. So twice a week I see Greg, twice a week I see Wadis. And I really made a commitment to improving biomechanics, even at a advanced stage, I guess, for a grappler. Yeah. But I just want to stay on the mat longer. That's really it. That's my whole purpose. But
we all do.
Yeah. So let's talk about those two things, biomechanics and strength. Because, back in the day, if you had a bad knee, it's like, oh, we got to strengthen that knee. And now we're talking more biomechanics, like going all the way up to the hip, right? Which is like, I wouldn't even think about that 10 years ago. So is there like a balance between the two? Is there something that you would say biomechanics is way more important than strength? And what's your opinion on that?
I think they are both equally important. To me, though, I've seen a ton of professional athletes competing at the highest level who've got really good strength and horrible biomechanics. And so those individuals, biomechanics, if I had to rank them 1 and 2, number 1 would be biomechanics and number 2 would be strength.
Okay.
And power. To me, you've got to have a combination of the two. But I've seen a ton of athletes who have phenomenal strength and amazing strength, but their biomechanics are horrible. In one of my presentations, I actually have a picture of RG3, and it was when he was doing combine testing, and he was on the triple jump, and when he landed, you saw that, here's this guy with these massive quads who can squat over 400 pounds. And when he landed, both of his knees went into a massive dynamic valgus. He was at a great risk for an ACL injury, and hence ended up having an ACL injury. So despite the fact that he had the strength and the power to compete at an NFL level, he still had the biomechanics that put him at risk.
At that point, in, you know, I guess like the evolution of your, you know, process, was that even looked at, the dynamic valgus?
During his testing, no, he actually, you know, and I used this. There was another movement assessment, I won't say which one, that was used during combines, and he passed that test. And then right after that went and did the triple jump, and you could clearly see that he was at high risk. So back in those days, it was not used. And quite honestly, it's still not used in significant numbers. You know, everybody wants to have a way to assess somebody in 5 minutes. You're not going to get a thorough assessment of anyone and their risk in 5 minutes. If you want to do it in 5 minutes, you might as well not do it.
Yeah.
In my opinion. You know, the AMI, I've worked really hard to make it a very efficient protocol. When you are experienced in it, you can use this, like I was using it in mass physicals with first responders. So police officers, firefighters, and military personnel. And we are running 110 individuals a day.
Wow.
We had some organizations that we worked with where we were assessing over 3,000 first responders. And so you can run large numbers of individuals and get some very meaningful information. But if you're looking for something to just do in 5 minutes, I personally don't think you can do it.
Yeah.
I don't think, number one, there has to be, in my opinion, some form of fatigue that's introduced. You know, all three of us, I guarantee you, if you do a test for 5 minutes, we're probably going to pass that.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, we're all on the mats, we're exercising, but if you do something that's 83 reps and 3 1-minute time tests, maybe you're going to start to draw some of that stuff out.
Yeah. And when you get them in that fatigue state and you start testing, I want to go back to that. What do you feel? I mean, obviously that you talk about a lot about the dynamic valgus, and that's like the, you know, very obvious, right? That you need to address. But if you were to rate the time to stability versus the dynamic valgus, what would take precedent over the other, and why would that be?
I would say dynamic valgus first, because it is the most researched, the most published, and quite honestly, we know that when your knee falls into dynamic valgus, there is a direct stress to the ACL. Time to stability does not necessarily put that direct stress to the ACL. But what we know is that if you lose your balance a lot, that you're at much greater risk. The other thing I would say that I think has a high correlation to risk is pelvic motion. And our system was actually the first one out there to actually measure pelvic motion that's on the market, and quantifying pelvic motion. How much pelvic motion, and one of the things that we're measuring right now, but we're not actually reporting out to users, is the speed at which your pelvis falls. Because I'm a firm believer, based on what we've seen at the elbow with UCL injuries in speed, and what we've seen at the knee in dynamic valgus in speed, I feel like there's a correlation to pelvic speed of motion and risk for labral tears, SI joint issues, as well as the impact that it has on the knee as well.
Okay. And what role does the upper torso play in all of this? You talk about
Huge.
pelvis down. Yeah.
Huge, absolutely huge. You know, and as a jiu-jitsu practitioner, I think,
first of all, I don't know where these questions are coming from.
I
have no idea.
No, that's awesome.
You're learning.
That's awesome.
I've been nerding out on your stuff, man.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
I tell you, you know, the center of mass displacement. So when I say center of mass, like right in between your two nipples, right, like right in the middle of your chest. Your center of mass displacement really, quite honestly, I never gave it enough credit to the impact that it has. But we all see it, right? Like when you go for a takedown, you know, if you bring their center of mass forward or you bring it backwards, you're going to be able to take that person down easier. And that's been part of my evolution as a physical therapist is my evolution in jiu-jitsu and better understanding of what I call functional biomechanics. I told somebody the other day when I got my black belt in jiu-jitsu, I got my PhD in functional biomechanics because you learn how to manipulate human biomechanics, right?
Yeah.
And so the center of mass displacement to me has been one of the things that, quite honestly, we're just now starting to see the pelvic motion coming into play in the research. I believe that at some point we're going to start seeing more research on center of mass displacement during single limb activities as being another form of predictor. And how do you, which is great. And then how do we actually create programming to actually improve that?
Nice.
Well, you even see that with like, say you're getting somebody back into squats after an ACL surgery, right? Like they're displacing their center of mass a lot, right? Like
for sure.
That's one thing I wanted to say about when you're talking about like dynamic valgus versus
time to stability.
Time to stability. One of the things with dynamic valgus, which I feel like you would address it sooner anyways, is because you can do the dynamic valgus with simple motion, right? Like, so just a regular squat, people will fall into that. And an air squat, they'll be falling into that dynamic valgus. And, you know, that time to stability is more of that when you're getting to the higher level. I mean, just going from double leg to single leg, but even on a higher basis for falling into dynamic valgus based off of time to stability, you're looking at like more like single leg hopping type of situations.
Okay.
So dynamic valgus can occur when you go up a flight of stairs.
Yep.
Gotcha.
You know, if you don't have good control, you're not going to have a time to stability issue there. You're going to have a dynamic valgus issue there. Because when you start to move yourself up, you're going to actually see you move into that dynamic valgus. And again, that's one of the things I absolutely love about, you know, what I'm learning around human movement and the impact that, you know, how do you determine, is that driven from your hip or is that driven from the foot and the ankle? And like, how do you start breaking that down? Is that a weakness around the foot and the ankle? And again, that's where, you know, the EMI comes into play. So, you know, one of the things that I never knew is the impact or how much information you can get from a side plank. Do you know, so side plank, we've done over 90,000 side planks. We've got data on over 90,000 side planks. One of the things that we've seen is if you start at the foot and the ankle, one of the things that you'll see is that most people should hold their ankles in a neutral position like this. If your foot rolls in like this and your tibia drops down to the ground, we call it a tibial drop. And what we've seen is that athletes who demonstrate that in a side plank, they're 3 times more likely to suffer an ankle sprain. I would have never known that from a side plank. Then you go up to the hip and then you start to see some of the movement dysfunction that's associated with lack of glute medius strength. You start to see some of rotation that comes from lack of transverse abdominis strength, quadratus lumborum strength, which is in your low back. You go up to the shoulder. If the shoulders are rolling forward, it tells you a lot about your rhomboid and serratus anterior strength on the downward arm. And what we've seen is that athletes who do that are at higher risk for labral tears if you're a baseball player. So the cool thing is, from a side plank alone, you just get so much information about risk from the foot and the ankle all the way up to the shoulder.
Okay, so let's just say we have someone with a, you know, RG3 type dynamic valgus. What's the protocol to strengthen that? How do you eliminate that?
Well, part of it is really kind of breaking down like where is your limitation? Everybody's a little bit different. Typically what I see is that if someone has dynamic valgus, but they're controlling their speeds pretty good, usually that's just kind of an isolated hip issue. If they have large amount of dynamic valgus and high speeds, that's more kinetic links in the chain that are falling it apart. So it really depends on the severity of the dynamic valgus and the speed of that dynamic valgus and where you're going to start breaking that down. So for somebody who's got high rates of speed and magnitude, I'm going to be looking at their foot and their ankle because all the kinetic chain at that point is falling apart.
Wow.
So at some point, your foot and ankle should give you some of that control. If it's not, you're not going to be able to control it. At some point, your core should be able to give you some of that control. If you're at the high numbers, somewhere along that system, it's not. So it really depends on what is the degree and the severity of it. And every individual is different.
Yeah.
You know, you may be really weak in your hip, and somebody else may be really weak at their foot and their ankle. Somebody else may be really weak in their core. You know, the other thing that I'm looking a lot at is how much pelvic rotation do people get when they do single limb activities? Because the rotational, what I'm finding is that the more rotational training I add to people, the less dynamic valgus and the less dysfunction that I'm actually seeing, and especially in single limb.
So
especially in single limb.
That's all the stuff we're working on now.
Yeah. I'm gonna layman's term that for you.
Please do.
So
Please do.
He basically said if you're going to a PT and they're having a tech have you do side steps, it's not going to fix everything.
Amen, brother. Amen, brother.
Yeah. Wadis has me wrapped in rubber bands and my body's turning one way and he's forcing me to go the other way. And my body's like screaming. I'm so sore right now. And it's not the hardest workout I've ever done, but it's the most, it's directly affecting all the deficiencies. And I have plenty, like my shoulders down, my torso's turned, my hips are up, you know, it's like, I'm a little bit of a mess right now. So
it's something different every time.
Yeah. Yeah. But I've you know, the hardest part is, you know, getting to a point where you're like, okay, I'm going to make a commitment to improve my biomechanics because I just want to improve my life. Right.
Yeah.
But okay. So how do you do that? Well, I've been seeing my PT twice a week and I don't think that's enough because half the time we're managing pain. Right.
Sure.
I crank my neck in the academy. We got to take a step back from what we're trying to accomplish biomechanically to address that pain. So what can people do just to kind of, help themselves along? And that could include, you know, I'm not talking about DIY. I'm talking about what's their first step? Do they just walk through a PT's office door and say, hey, I'm a mess, or what is that? How does that work?
Well, you know, Greg and I think would both agree on this. Number one is that if you are a jiu-jitsu athlete, is you really need to try to find in your area a PT that understands jiu-jitsu. Because, you know, I can't tell you how many of our athletes I've seen that have been returned to sport and they just, quite honestly, they shouldn't be.
Yeah.
Or they've not been properly prepared for that process. Not all PTs are the same. What I would encourage people to do is to go interview your PT. I used to have patients come in all the time and just meet with me and ask questions and interview. And you'll know pretty quickly, and by your observation of what's going on around and what's going on in the clinic itself, you should be able to tell a lot. And Greg, what would you, you know, you and I are both in the same boat because Greg and I talk about this all the time, you know, and I will tell you, you know, I've been in this profession for 25 years. I am the harshest critic of my own profession because I will tell you there are some phenomenal PTs out there, but they're rare.
Yeah. Yeah.
You are very fortunate you got one sitting in your backyard, actually sitting in your podcast right now.
Dude, I have his personal number too. So I know, crazy. Right? I'm absolutely crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's really, really hard to find, you know, and there's a lot of PTs out there that say that they do ACL rehab.
Yeah.
And quite honestly, I would say maybe 1% should actually be doing ACL rehab.
Wow.
Yeah, you get people into your office that's like they're halfway through their ACL rehab, and you're like, "What have you been working on?" I've been doing a lot of quad exercises. You're like,
yeah.
Did they give you anything for your hips?
Yeah.
What kind of exercise would that look like? Did they not describe why you were doing your exercises? No, they just had somebody take me through my list, and then I went home. You know, it's insane, especially for something as critical as a ACL surgery, right? Like that might work for like, oh, I had a little bit of knee pain, so I went to my PT. And then are you probably going to have more knee pain later on? Yeah,
probably,
and fairly quickly because all they did was address that specific issue that you were having that day,
So, well, and I'll tell you, one of the things that Greg does, and that I think, that I do as well, is you educate patients on why you're doing the why behind what you're doing.
Yeah.
And to me, that's important for several factors. Number one is that as a patient, it tells you that your PT actually knows what they're talking about, because they're describing to you why you're actually doing this particular exercise. And two, it also empowers you to have an understanding of why you're doing that particular exercise. And what we find is that you're more likely to do it when I ask you to do it.
Yeah. I want to ask you one more question. I know we're up against it time wise, but so in my academy, I'm pretty strict. Like, athlete safety is like paramount for me. Like that's
sure.
If they learn jiu-jitsu along the way, awesome. I just want all their fingers and toes, when they come in and when they leave. So, whenever somebody gets, put to sleep, strangled, put to sleep, I don't let them roll after that.
Yeah.
And because I consider that be pretty close-ish to maybe a concussion, like a striking
Absolutely.
concussion.
Yes, you should.
Yeah. So how long after that should I don't want to say penalize them, but force them to kind of just do drilling or not roll? Because I don't want to make it worse. Right.
Right.
So what's your opinion on that?
When it comes to concussion, studies show that kids are less resilient than adults. So that's number one. And so I think with kids, I think your time frame should be a little bit more than it is with adults. And again, I think it depends on the individual. Have they, so to give a blank statement is kind of hard.
Yeah.
It's really going to depend on if I've got somebody who's had multiple concussions, because loss of consciousness in someone who's had multiple concussions, that's a much greater issue.
Yeah.
Versus someone who has just lost consciousness for the first time. So, it's going to depend on the frequency of loss of consciousness. It's going to depend on their concussion history, and it's also going to depend on their age. So I think, for most people, 24 to 48 hours, you should be pretty good. I mean, loss of as long as it's not a sustained loss of consciousness.
Right. Yeah.
But the fact that you are looking at loss of consciousness correlated to concussion, I think is a strong correlation. I mean, there's a lot of good studies out there, and that it's actually something that's being researched a little bit more.
Yeah.
Because although you don't get the coup contra coup effect that you get with concussion. So somebody hits you, your brain goes backwards and hits the skull, and then it comes forward and hits the skull.
Yeah. And
that's a lot of times what causes that neurological disruption. In loss of consciousness, it's just a loss of airflow to the brain.
Yeah.
So the mechanisms are different, whereas the loss of oxygen piece is going to probably be a little bit less profound than the actual contact of the brain on the backside to the front side.
Gotcha. Yeah. I just, I had a friend, he got a pretty severe concussion in a training session. My wife was with him, and his wife, they took him to the hospital, and it was one of those where he was asking, like, what happened? What time is it? Did somebody call Paul? Stuff like that.
Yep.
And he asked those questions about every 30 seconds. He was asking the same questions, and they're like, and they kind of played along, and after a while they were a little concerned. He got better, but along the way, he was one of those, like, I feel good, I'm going to train today. Yeah. Well, then he suffered a torn bicep, and then he had a catastrophic knee.
Oh, wow.
And then he had this, and then he had that. And I think it all started with that severe concussion.
For sure. Yeah. For sure. Especially there is a strong correlation of concussion to ACL. Wow. You are 3 times more likely to have an ACL injury if you've had a concussion up to 3 years post-concussion. Now, that being said, it doesn't 3 years. And so that doesn't mean that the neurological disruption is what is causing your ACL, but it's the movement disruption that results in the increased risk over time.
Yeah.
So, what I always tell people is that, we know that there is a risk factor with concussion in ACL risk. And for those individuals, I'm really going to be taking a good look at their movement as a part of their concussion return to sport. So there is a protocol for assessing someone for return to sport after a concussion. The one piece that I add to that is a movement assessment component to that.
That's great. I'm going to start sending, like, if somebody gets concussed, I'll start sending them to you.
I actually have a concussion, like a whole system that I use. So,
nice.
And it actually
That's fantastic.
It actually includes a movement it's the same one that the UFC uses.
Oh, great. So, yeah. Well, listen, Doc, you're the man. I'm telling you, I've been nerding out on your stuff, and
awesome.
I think more and more people are going to start following you, just with all the research that you've done, your history. And if you've never heard Trent's story of how he decided he wanted to be a physical therapist, please YouTube it. It chokes you up. It's a great story.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you sharing that, because
thank you. I appreciate that.
When I heard it, I was like, yeah, this is there's very few people in this world that know what they want to do at a very, very young age.
Yeah.
And you're lucky to be one of them, man.
Mine was set on December 26, 1979.
Yeah. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, we were on a family vacation, and we were in the ocean in a foreign country, and my father suffered a C5, 6, 7 burst fracture. And my brother and I had to pull my father out of the ocean so he didn't drown, and then taped him to a surfboard with duct tape, and then took him to a third world hospital. And he found out that day he was quadriplegic. And so it was from that point that I really decided I wanted to be a PT.
Man, and
yeah,
there's way more to the story. So please YouTube it. Please listen to it. I've
got a video on there where I talk about it.
Yeah. I watched the video. It's one of the first ones I watched when I was doing research for this.
Oh, you did?
Show. Yeah. And I was like, this is a good dude. I definitely.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. Let everybody know where they can find you on social media and all the other platforms.
Yeah, BJJ PT, and then you can also find me under The Athlete Lab on Instagram.
Awesome. Greg, thank you for coming on. Thank you for setting this up, man. This is awesome. Yeah. And, hopefully it won't take another 100 episodes to get you back on the show. And I'd love to get you in studio. If you're ever in town, please, short notice, we'll just jump on and we'll talk about whatever.
Actually, I'm in town Saturday.
Let's go. You want to come on Sunday?
Yeah.
Well, let's wait a little bit longer.
Absolutely.
All right, my friend. You take care.
All right. Thanks, guys, and Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you.
Bye.
This episode is brought to you by BioPro Plus. BioPro Plus is the faster, easier, and safer non-synthetic alternative to painful, expensive, and invasive anti-aging hormone treatments. The growth factors in BioPro Plus have the unique ability to regulate and restart the body's natural sex hormone production, and it also assists in raising glutathione levels, improving immune response, repairing DNA, promoting enhanced protein absorption, and supporting self-differentiation and proliferation. I don't know what any of that means, but I can tell you this. I've been using this stuff for about a year, and my ability to recover is through the roof. I'm training jiu-jitsu 3 times a week. I'm lifting weights 2 times a week, and the amount of time it takes for me to recover has reduced significantly. I'm 51 years old, and as an aging grappler, I got to do everything I can to stay on the mats. So I go through a pretty regimented recovery system, and BioPro. I also use the evening version. I forget what it's called, but it's fantastic. Get this stuff. Go to www.bioproteintech.com and put the promo code Foxcast. Promo code Foxcast will get you $30 off your order. Hit them up. You won't regret it.